Welcome. My name is Tim Smith. I'm a principal at Rouse Consultancy, and I will be leading this session today. Good morning to those of you in California. Good afternoon, early evening to those of you in Europe, and maybe good evening to you somewhere else as well. Anyway, welcome all of you. The session today is all about the IP team of 2025 sitting within the professionalism strand of this CIP forum. And what we have today is a fantastic panel that is going to help us to explore the questions around the essential question is in the changing world that we have around us, with so much changing and so much in the world changing relating to IP and intellectual assets. The essential question we're asking today is, in order to meet the challenges of the future, what should in-house IP teams of 2025 look like? That's going to be the discussion today. As I said, we have a fantastic selection of panelists on this. I'm going to introduce them all now. So the panelists are Maikke van Velzen from Philips, Sandra Novak from 3M, Jeremiah Chan from Facebook, Ben from Pacific View, sorry, I forget the name of your business, Ben, your current consultancy, Ben Wang from Pacific View, and Peter Fiske from Berkeley. Let me then spend a little time introducing each of them. So Maikke van Velzen is head of IP for Connected Care at Philips within the IP and standards team. Maikke is a business-driven IP professional with a focus on creating international IP portfolio, IP scouting and acquisition, and long-term IP strategy. She's had a range of roles in the last 10 years within Philips IP and standards, touching on all aspects of IP, including IP counseling, IP portfolio management, licensing, acquisition, and enforcement, and also dealing with all types of IP. She's very interested in particular in the role that IP plays in the services and solution-driven business, and leads Philips IP activities in relation to artificial intelligence and software-based inventions. So I think she will have a very interesting perspective. We also have Sandra Novak, who's Chief IP Counsel for the Consumer Business Group of 3M. You will all know 3M as the business which makes and sells iconic consumer products with brands including Post-it, Scotch, and Command. Sandra has a 15 years experience at 3M, and she's worked on a variety of IP issues from patent, trademark, domain name, trade secret, litigation matters, negotiated numerous global IP agreements, and has filed or prosecuted over 100 patent applications. Before that, her background was as an IP attorney in private practice, and before her legal career, she was a chemist working in chemical research. And she's also passionate about diversity. I know that she and Jeremiah have already appeared this week in the CIP forum on the diversity panel. So on to Jeremiah. Jeremiah Chan is head of patents at Facebook. Jeremiah leads a team that's responsible for the strategic development of its global patent portfolio. He and his team also work on IP transactions, dispute resolution, and other risk mitigation initiatives, as well as industry-wide efforts to promote greater diversity in innovation. Jeremiah is a member of the USPTO's Patent Public Advisory Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on artificial intelligence and services on innovation expansion. Previously in his career, he led international teams at Google and JDSU, and before that was in private practice. Ben Wang, currently Managing Director of Pacific Viewpoint Group. Apologies, Ben, I've got the name right now, Pacific Viewpoint Group. Ben is an attorney and a patent attorney with over 20 years of legal and industry experience, advising biopharma and high-tech companies on their legal matters. Currently based in San Francisco, his practice spans the spectrum of technology and IP laws, including patent procurement, litigation, licensing, and contract negotiation. Until recently, Ben served as Vice President and Chief IP Counsel for ZTE in the US, where he provided strategic and tactical guidance to the business, including handling the successful negotiation with the US Department of Commerce on its denial order against ZTE in 2018. Prior to that, Ben spent 5 years in China as Unilever's head of IP for North Asia, establishing its brand and patent operation in Shanghai. And finally, and certainly not least, Peter Fiske. Welcome, Peter, is Executive Director of NAWI, the National Alliance for Water Innovation. NAWI is a team of 3 Department of Energy national labs and over 20 universities and companies selected by the Department of Energy in September 2019 to lead the Energy Water Desalination Hub. The hub is a 5-year project to build a national integrated research program to radically cut the cost and energy consumption for desalination in a variety of applications. Prior to that, Peter was the Chief Executive Officer at Pax Water Technologies, where he pioneered the use of biomimicry to help to develop innovative and energy efficient technologies for the water industry. So you'll see that we have amongst the IP professionals, we have the entrepreneur and the businessman as well. So welcome, Peter. Thank you for adding that extra perspective. And finally, I'll very briefly introduce my colleague, Chris Bailey. Chris is also a principal at Rouse, and Chris works supporting businesses commercializing their technology in China, typically US or European businesses. Chris has lived in China. And that is the introduction to the panelists. And now what I probably should have done beforehand is give you nice pictures there so you can try and tie the names to the names to the faces if you haven't done that already on the display. So on to the session itself. And this is an image that shows us the central question that we're asking. In order to meet the challenges of the future, what should the IP team of 2025 look like?
Tim, we're not seeing that yet.
You're not seeing that?
I'm not.
I'm told I am screen sharing. Maybe I should stop sharing. Chris, are you on mute?
Yeah.
What are you seeing? Are you seeing
an autosave button?
That's what we see.
Oh, that's not very helpful, is it? Okay, let's stop that sharing. Escape from this. I do apologize.
The joys of Zoom.
Yeah, I wish it's very odd showing us that. Okay.
There we go.
That's it.
Is that looking better?
Yep.
And are we getting it now? Still
Yep.
sharing?
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay. Good. Thank you for your patience there. So there we go. This is a diagram to represent the central question that we're asking. What should the IP team for 2025 look like in order to meet the challenges of the future? The changes and the forces we see at play shaping in-house IP teams, we group into 3 different areas. And that's the structure we're bringing to the conversation today. So we see external forces acting on the business, internal forces acting within the business, and forces acting on the IP service provider market. So let me give you a tiny bit more on what I mean by each of those. So external forces, we're talking about major forces within industry and within the world. So we talk about deglobalization and the decoupling of the US and China, exemplified perhaps most recently with the RCEP trade agreement, looking to put Japan, China, and Korea on a trade agreement for the first time, really creating an Eastern Bloc. We look at digitalization, obviously a mega trend affecting how businesses offer their products and services to the market. We see artificial intelligence and machine learning, major forces changing the way that products are produced, the way that businesses innovate, and the way that data is analyzed. And then, of course, we see environmentalism and climate change operating on the way businesses think about their assets, in particular their physical assets. The internal forces, what do we mean by internal forces? We mean, say, forces within the business. And I've captured here a few that we'll come on to talk about it in some substance. But these are things like budget pressure or the accountability for investment of the IP team. And we'll also be looking at these IP service provider market forces. These are very active at the moment. We see them operating in many different ways, where we're seeing deregulation and delegalization, meaning the shift away from law firms into other corporate service providers, and disintermediation being pressures that might remove the roles of patent and trademark attorneys as intermediaries between companies and IP offices. these are the three sets of forces we're going to look at. We're going to start by looking at the external forces. We have about an hour in this session now, and this first part is going to be really kind of to whet our appetite. We're then going to move on to internal forces and the forces acting on the IP service provider as the kind of meat of the conversation. And then what I'll do in the final 15 minutes or so is I want to come back, having reflecting on the discussion, to be saying, what do we need to be teaching the students of today to put them in the right place so that they can lead the IP functions of businesses in 20 years hence? So that way we bring it back to the CIP forum theme of the engagement with the student community as well, and the professionalism within the industry. And in that final session, we welcome people to put up their hands and ask questions. In the sessions, as we're going through the panelists, you're very welcome to put questions into the chat function, and Chris will be there to moderate those and look out for interesting questions coming up there. But I'd ask you to stay within the chat function during the main session, and then we'll open up at the end. So starting off in this first part of external forces, what I'd like to do for each of the panelists, first of all, is kind of just as a warm-up, I'd like to ask each of you to indicate which of these four, or another force if you see there's another powerful force out there, will be the single most important driver for change within IP teams by 2030. What I'm asking you to imagine is that you're not in your current position, so you're not looking at it just through the lens of your current employer. And we're looking quite objectively at the role of in-house IP teams across IP-rich businesses. This is a little appetite whetter, so if I just ask you to limit it to a couple of minutes to help us with this future forecasting, and then we can return to the questions of what this means in looking at internal forces and the forces within the IP service provider market. Maikke, if I might ask you first, perhaps you could let us know, if we're looking at these four forces or another force, which you see is going to be a really significant driver in the next 10 years or so. Maikke, I can't hear you, Maikke. No. The technology gremlins are with us today. Now it says you're definitely on mute. And now it says you're not on mute, but I'm afraid we can't hear you. I'll move on. I think that's suggesting move on. Maybe Sandra, if I could come to you, Sandra Novak at 3M. Perhaps I could come to you and you'd like to give us your view on where you see, whether it's one of these forces or another force.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Very good.
All right, good. Well, you know, I hate to go first because I'm not going to choose any of these. I'll choose an additional one, go off script. You know, one of the external forces I see, and maybe not the biggest, but one that I want to make sure that we mention, is the virtual and remote offices and working that we've gotten more comfortable with during the pandemic. You know, the consensus is that generally remote or virtual work during this pandemic has gone better than we expected or maybe feared. We've shown the ability to be effective and efficient. And post-pandemic, it seems like some degree of this type of virtual or remote work is likely to continue. So you'll see economists spoke to the Washington Post recently and said, you know, people have changed their habits, and some of those habits are going to stick. Further, 1 in 5 chief financial officers surveyed said they plan to keep at least 20% of their workforce working remotely to help manage cost. So even if the legal profession doesn't continue the virtual remote, I think it's likely that our clients and business colleagues will. And that offers both some advantages and challenges that I think we need to start thinking about now as we handle that post-pandemic, and as you said, in 2025. You know, as I said, there's lots of advantages. You know, the ability to not be geographically constrained can provide greater opportunity to hire diverse candidates and potentially even better and more subject matter expert talent, because you're no longer limited to your geographic circle or bubble. For some employees, many employees, greater job satisfaction is had by the ability to work from home or remotely. It allows that balance of work-life balance and the elimination of the commute. All of these can really contribute to retention of our valuable employees. It may provide greater ability for corporations to include non-local law firms in their preferred networks of outside counsel. And it may lower the travel costs and potentially lower the US litigation costs if we continue to support things like in-person depositions and the like. However, there's also a lot of challenges. I mean, as you saw today, the IT will continue to be a challenge. Also, once we've hired these amazing new talent that are not necessarily geographically constrained, how do we effectively onboard them and train them and retain them? Also, how do we continue to have the cultures that we've worked so hard to establish in our law firms and corporations when everyone is remote? How do you continue to collaborate in a very different working environment where not everyone is remote post-pandemic? Additionally, how are we going to handle jury trials? Virtual remote jury trials right now disfavored, although available. So that will still continue, and how do we handle those? And lastly, I don't want to minimize the fact that while working remote creates job satisfaction for many, it can make others feel very professionally isolated. That can have negative effects on well-being, but also on career development. So I think, as we look forward to the world 5 years from now, some of these habits are going to stick, and there'll be more virtual or remote working than there was pre-pandemic. However, if we start looking at these issues now, I hope that we can better manage some of those cost benefits, advantage, disadvantages for what our working situations will look like in 2025.
Wonderful. That's a very interesting kickoff. Lots of interesting issues there in terms of availability of talent pool, diversity of talent that's available, geographical diversity of talent. And I think it's probably worth mentioning at this point, we're conscious that this is taking place in a time zone which is not very beneficial for China. And Chris and I, we work in a business where we have a significant number of colleagues in China, and we see the development of the IP landscape in China and the East as a really important piece in this. We were not able to bring in the China voice into this conversation, but it's something we want to do. And in fact, indeed, Chris and I are going to be hosting a roundtable on this issue with Chinese IP Council in future and bring that voice into the CIP Forum IP Team of 2025 discussion as well. And so I think that's an angle we'd like to join in, and it builds on what you were saying there, Sandra, about the availability of different talent. You're also talking about technology enabling that. And if I could actually moving on to Jeremiah, ask you, I guess, Jeremiah, if you have any immediate reflections on what Sandra's saying, but then also to take us into your perspective on which of these is going to be the most important forces.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. One of the things I really like about CIP is fundamentally they have a very kind of interdisciplinary approach when it comes to intellectual property and innovation, and kind of channeling that interdisciplinary outlook. I would say, that's kind of my reaction and my response to the question, which is there's so many of these things on your slide that are interrelated. And if we don't pay attention to kind of how they connect, how they intersect, and signals around us, I think we start to miss out quite a bit of learning that we can actually apply to teams of the future. And my hope is that the teams of the future will learn and we will evolve. So I guess I'd first start by the topic of the panel that Sandra and I were just on, diversification. Along the lines of paying attention to what's around us right now, it's hard to miss that we're in the middle of a pandemic. But one of the really interesting things that I don't know, how many of our audience members have really been kind of looking into this and looking into the studies, COVID-19 outcomes are better in female-led countries. And initially there was lots of anecdotal evidence. And I've had lots of discussions on social media about this with some people saying, it's just a coincidence. They got lucky. Now there's actually research coming out. And the latest research that I found very interesting was from professors Garikapati and Kambhampati that actually came out to demonstrate, is this actually founded in the data and research? They found that it is. Statistically, female-led countries were quicker to lock down and had fewer COVID fatalities than comparable male-led countries. And if we don't learn from this, or if we believe that this female leadership and what we can learn from it doesn't really apply to intellectual property or teams of the future, that's I think you're probably sadly mistaken. I think there is something there, and what we have been seeing quite a bit over a number of years is we've started to see and realize that there is a lack of female leadership. And frankly, people like Maikke and Sandra on my panel who are in senior roles at their companies, but they are very few and far between. There are not many of them. And I would bet that for many of the rooms that they walk into, they are the first. This needs to change because I think we are missing out on the female leadership and the diversification it brings. You know, half of my team is female. That's been a process. The vast majority of the female patent attorneys on my team are moms. And I would share in my own experience, moms I have found are extraordinary performers. They have experienced a different level of pressure and competing demands. They've somehow, I think, learned over the course of their lives how to multitask and execute at a different level. And I really don't think the world of IP has capitalized on this yet. In the next 5 years, I think we will continue to see diversification in IP teams of the future because diverse teams deliver better results. And frankly, if we don't, or it's slow going, you know, for me, that's okay because I'll just keep hiring the diverse talent. I'll keep hiring the moms and my teams will just deliver better results than everyone else. So that's number one, diversification. Quick note on deglobalization. I don't spend a lot of time on this one because I think it is actually quite temporal and just kind of a moment in time. I think it's inevitable for increased globalization of our economy, of innovation and intellectual property. I think what we've been seeing lately with all the trade wars and everything else is probably a big function of the administration that we've had in the US and other leaders in the world. But I think it's very short-sighted, the leadership and guidance that they've had. And hopefully over time, they will go back to increased globalization because we have to have that. We are one world, we are one community, we've got to work together. So I don't spend too much time on the longer term effects of that because I think it will change and kind of go back to where we were headed in the longer trajectory of increased globalization. Digitalization and AI, I kind of bring those two together because they're very, very connected. You really can't have one without the other. And I think, you know, in my mind, the way it's always worked is digitalization always needs to happen before AI can really be harnessed. You've got to have the data to be able to teach the machine learning, to be able to perform a lot of these sophisticated functions that we need. And in many ways, the better the data you have, the better the AI systems and models and tools. So they're very, very connected. I think we will continue to evolve and grow in that area. And it is really going to change the teams of the future that I think we'll talk a little bit more about later in this panel. But I think that's a really big one that's going to change the fabric of how IP teams of the future will operate. It's going to have a profound impact on the way we do things, the way we approach things. And I'm excited to see that future.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremiah. I think that what we've had this discussion once already in a CIP round table amongst a smaller group, and certainly that I think what you're saying really echoes one of the themes there, which is the importance of this multiplicity of perspectives, whether that's business or technology or IP or gender or culture or age or skills. These are really complex problems, and you need to have an environment in which you can bring together all of those different perspectives in order to come to the best outcomes. Let me move on, if I may, to Ben, because I know he's somebody who's spent time in the US and in China, and I think in Germany as well. So Ben, could I turn to you? You've seen this picture from a number of different angles. Perhaps I could invite you in now and say, which of these external forces do you see as if you had to choose one, which would it be?
Sure. So looking at the slide, I think I would address the deglobalization portion of the pie. As Jeremiah has mentioned, I think the issue of deglobalization or globalization, which way you're looking at it, is going to be an important factor, largely because intellectual property itself can be utilized both as an offensive and defensive weapon. For that matter, even if you are locally focused, for example, your products only sold in Northern Europe, hypothetically. However, it does not mean that your intellectual property assets should still be limited to only that region that you're selling. This is by definition. So I think it's very important for companies, executives to consider building their IP teams with that in perspective in mind. And I sort of go back to my experience about 10 years ago when I went to China to build a brand new IP team for Unilever, which is a company based in Europe. At the time, it was based in London, now in the Netherlands. I think the reason it was important to have a global perspective for Unilever was because obviously it was selling products in China. But having had the experience of working both in China and in Europe, as well as in the US now, I think for companies that are maybe not as large as Unilever, even for startups, some of my clients now are actually startups, you still really want to have that perspective that your assets will be important globally, not just what you're doing here in your local market territory. So I think it's like, again, we've talked about the current political environment. There's trade wars between China and US, there's decoupling, blah, blah, blah. That even assuming that may be true, and Jeremiah has mentioned with changes in the next few years, things might warm up between China and US. But again, even assuming that's not the case, that remains so, that means that from a different perspective, maybe there's more opportunity in Europe. If there's there's a lack of availability of US interactions with Chinese parties, perhaps European companies will have a better shot in terms of being more receptive by their Chinese collaborating partners. So, and intellectual property certainly is a very important piece in that matter when you're dealing with cross-border transactions. So I think the globalization issue is going to be always an important one for IP asset management, whatever political wind, whichever direction is blowing. The other thing that I wanted to address just really quickly, going back to what Sandra was saying, is it's very true. Nowadays with the pandemic, Zooming, meeting or Teams, whatever, all these tools are absolutely wonderful. We're having a overload of online meetings, and that really gets people so much easier access. I was in a meeting with the patent director at Silicon Valley, Wayne. He was saying that nowadays actually the patent office productivity is actually much higher than before the pandemic because of the technology. So what I wanted to add is, at the same time, it does not replace. We cannot be complacent in terms of thinking, oh, let's just set up a meeting. I remember over the telephone or Zoom, I remember working in China, some of my team members and my internal clients, they were very, very much appreciative of having face-to-face meetings with me and my team member. And I say that because if you are working in a relatively mature market, like my US clients, I can do a lot of things without even meeting the client. In terms of exchanging invention disclosures, getting bills paid, et cetera, et cetera. But in a market like in China, and for that matter, even in a developed environment with a smaller team, startups, engineers who have not had a lot of experience with IP, I think we as professionals, and when we build an IP team, we want to really embed these thoughts, these ideas to our team members, that you want to be more focus on the clients, understand what are the ways that they can accept, they can communicate with you, whether it's in person or over Zoom. Just be mindful of that perspective, and then basically drive the interaction between the inventors, the business executives, and the attorneys. Because again, a lot of information, body language, reaction to what you're saying may be lost in terms of these Zoom meetings. So I just wanted to caution people in that regard that, yes, I see this is going to remain. The Zoom thing is going to remain after the pandemic is over, and let's hope it's over soon. But at the same time, we want to be on our toes in terms of having effective, increased efficiency in communicating with our clients.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben. Again, really interesting perspectives, as you say, from having spent time in different parts and seeing how these intellectual assets kind of sit above what might be the winds of change in trade. And also, I think, as you say, connecting back with Sandra in this connectedness, but this disconnectedness that we're all feeling at the moment. Maikke, any luck with that mic? Okay.
Can
That
you hear me now?
sounds good to us.
Great.
Welcome.
Great.
Perhaps you
Thanks.
could give us your thoughts on which of these you see as a
Yeah.
as a really interesting force.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I heard now is really interesting, and because it was the pandemic that accelerated a lot of what we would have seen happening probably otherwise over a lot of years. That is definitely influencing what the IP team will look like later in several years from now. But one of the factors that I consider as really highly influential as well is this digitalization. And I see that as a really relevant force because it modifies how we do business, and it modifies the business models and the way that our businesses generate revenues. And through that, we need to look at control points and IP in the context of control points that are much broader than how we do that today. So I expect that digitalization in business models and the influence it will have on how we generate revenues and value in the company will mean that by nature, actually the IP component will be seen as one of many possibilities to create control points for your business. And in addition to that, I think having those new business models means that we need to think in an integrated manner on types of IP that we will use. There will be a shift in what types of IP will be relevant going forward, what types of IP will be really determining a lot of the value for the company. And I see that through those changes, we probably also need to work on the composition of the teams in the IP department. I expect that many years from now, maybe even sooner than we think, the teams will be more diverse, will have very mixed backgrounds. The traditional IP people will be there, will have a role, but definitely there'll be substantive people with more business insights, business experience, people who come in from one or another dimension actually into the IP world. And I think that will lead to a lot of cross-fertilization in the teams, diverse perspectives, and a higher value add. I also expect actually that the business models will diversify, where we very often have looked in the past at business models as well. This business is more exclusive, that business is more doing licensing. I expect that IP teams will drive a change of thinking in that there will be coexistence of certain business models, and that IP will be far more dynamic and handled in a more dynamic way than it is today.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, I think that multiplicity of perspectives, the real need for that, and a shift away from just a traditional narrow view of legal IP rights is a theme that we're seeing coming through strongly. I think it's something we'll touch on again when we move into the internal forces and the IP service provider market forces. Peter, your perspective as an innovator and coming at this not as an IP professional, but as somebody who's no doubt accessed IP services, we certainly heard from a number of the panelists about there may be a greater accessibility of IP services to you, particularly with this remote connection and things. How do you see some of these forces playing into way IP's dealt with?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim, and thank you all for inviting me to your party. Maybe you don't often hear from a scientist and the people from the innovation community. You work with them every day. I come from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, one of the United States premier science laboratories. We have an embedded IP department who I work with, so I actually have a perspective, and I've also run businesses with IP resources. So Tim, your initial charge, notwithstanding the fact that in the Zoom world, not only can I enjoy my breakfast while we have this meeting, the downside, of course, is my day started at 4:30 this morning with another conference in Europe and is now going through my day and ends at about 7 p.m. tonight. So many of you are probably experiencing that. But Tim, to your question about these external forces, there's one I want to share with you all that's transforming the science, the business of doing science, and I think it's going to transform how you all do your business as well. And that is artificial intelligence and machine learning. Already we are seeing in the practice of science that these tools of artificial intelligence are enabling us to construct and execute vast amounts of intellectual work as scientists very rapidly. Instead of having hands-on experiments, we can now set up schema in a computer and actually churn through billions of configurations and arrive at predictions of the performance long before scientists could ever achieve those ends. For example, the Duracell battery that you now buy, the cathode material in that battery was designed entirely by a computer. It didn't have a chemist, it had a programmer. Now, those of you who are in the intellectual business of strategizing the frameworks of logic and scanning a large body of text, I think this is going to transform your world. I think the ways in which you will, I hope you have tools at your disposal that can help us as innovators more quickly arrive at defensible positions for our inventions is going to be critical. And I would also say that those of us who look for IP services will be looking for those firms and looking for those professionals who have that innovation mindset, that have new tools to bring to the table for us, for our benefit. So I think that that's going to be an urgency back for you in your communities. What innovation do we see in how we do our business and how we do our workflows that are going to feed value back to clients like me?
That's fantastic, and I think it already touches on a couple of things we're going to come to in the internal forces and the IP service provider market forces, and powerful comments. I'm conscious that we've got lots of rich ideas already, and that we've got quite a lot of the deck to go through. So let me move on, and let me make sure my technology gremlins are not going to be there. So again, this next section, I'd like to look at these internal forces. What I've described them here. I'll just run through them very quickly. Budget pressure. We see in-house IP teams often under budget pressure. Is that because they're too often seen just as risk managers and not part of the value creation? The need for speed. Business cycles get ever faster. How can IP teams catch up with? Are we seeing them lagging behind in the speed of business cycles or speed of innovation cycles that Peter's talking about? Data. There's a huge amount of data. We've heard in businesses informing decision making, and in science, as we've heard, informing decision making. Are we seeing that yet in IP? Are we behind on that? These are some of the questions we have. IP ownership and tax is a whole nother issue and a whole other world. And what should the voice of the IP team be in that, and how should they interact with the CFO in those kind of conversations? And fundamentally, the accountability of investment. You are there as head of IP, accountable for the investment that's made in IP. How do you show value in that? I've got a couple of slides that we've is in the research that we've done, which are interesting. This one. This is as part of the research. We'd set up this IP team in 2025 and some of these teams already. And then part of the research, we found a Deloitte global study looking at the future of legal services generally. And the challenges that really came through there were doing more with less, something that resonates with something we saw. Risk management, that different how do you approach risk when cycles are moving ever faster? As I said, with the speed of business. These are the top challenges. So we recognize those challenges. What tools are they using to support them in that? I think this thing on this section on the right is really interesting, because this is really about the use of AI within corporate legal departments. And if I can this shows us within 2 to 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and more than 10 years away. And if we look at that, say within 10 years, still less than half of the participants are saying that AI will be mainstream in corporate legal departments. That feels to me too slow, and is something that I think is a challenge that we need to address as part of typically legal departments. The other piece, again, this has already been touched upon, but I think it's really good to see, good to point out, is these changing forms of IP. And we've got this. If we look at Francis Gurry, former head of WIPO. Today, huge amounts of data are being generated. Much of it falls outside the traditional categories of IP. We need diversity. We need to think about these assets in a very different way. And what we see on the right, which is really a precursor to the external services provider market, is we're now seeing a whole range of different IP service providers entering the market as part of this delegalization. These are changes we're seeing already. So if I can kind of return back to this slide. And I'm going to come back to Maikke, because it's a point we've discussed briefly before about the use of AI and technology for IP professionals, and whether you see them as embracing that or not.
Yeah, I think this is something that is showing a similar profile as in other professions, that people tend to see it as a threat, but I think we have managed to turn that around now, at least with the majority in our department, to see it as an opportunity. It is a little bit like an analogy of how we talk to our radiologists that we work with in the hospitals. Radiologists initially said, well, what can AI do for me except actually take my job away? And then we now actually said, no, that's definitely not it. It's going to augment you in your work. It's going to be the radiologists who embrace it, who will be there, but the ones who deny the relevance and the value of data and AI-based tools, those might not exist anymore in many years, but the others certainly will. So it's all about augmenting what you do. It's helping you to create speed. It's helping you to create quality in what you do. And it's, for me, also a great way to actually support the scientists in making the IP process easier for them. Because I think one of the things that I see as a task of in-house counsel is to make the life of the inventors easy. And if we have tools to support them, help them also point them to relevant paragraphs in prior art, to help them even invent. Everybody here knows about the activities of iProba. Support them in finding new opportunities, open up the mindset. I think then AI can be a great way, analyzing data can be a great way to help us in doing our work more effective and efficient, and with better quality and with more fun for everybody in the end. Brilliant.
Thank you, Maikke. Again, powerful comments. And having talked about data, I want to take it back to Jeremiah, because he obviously he spoke already around the volume of data that's available and how it's being used. Our perception, Jeremiah, and I'm sure it's not the case within your team, within Facebook as an extremely data-rich business, but we see many IP teams not really embracing the data and the availability, the power that resides in the data. What are your comments on that?
Oh, no, I don't think it's a perception, Tim. I think it's reality. Yeah, I think both for patent departments and then even more broadly legal have been really slow to embrace. You know, we're calling it AI. I mean, it probably makes sense to just like make sure we have alignment on that, because if you look at articles and listen to talks on AI, there's kind of an abuse of the phrases people use: AI, analytics, data science. I mean, all sorts of things that are kind of like mushed into the same thing. I would say for our purposes today, when I talk about it, I'm generally talking about the use of data and computation to deliver better outcomes. Better being more efficient, more effective, et cetera, like demonstrably better outcomes. And in that regard, I would say, you know, patent departments and legal departments have been very slow to actually implement these things for some very good reasons that I'll get into in a second. But the first thing I would say is there are some folks out there who say the only reason is because what we do and the decisions we make in legal, they're just too complex. And there I would say, go do some Google searches and go do your research, because you definitely don't know how far AI has come. I mean, this is now years ago where the DeepMind team was able to train AlphaGo, and it was able to beat the world champion in the game of Go. If you've never played the game of Go, give it a try. That's not checkers. Okay, it's pretty complicated, and there are a whole lot of different options at each stage of the game. So my thought is always, in response to some of these comments, if you think it's not complex enough to be able to handle these functions that we all perform, many of them, you just got to go look into it, because it's come a long way and it's continuing to grow exponentially in terms of the capability and the training that it's able to do. So that's number one. In terms of why so much resistance, I mean, kind of going back to what Maikke said, there definitely is that fear, but I would kind of boil it down to four things that I often talk about. One is, in the world of legal, efficiency is often public enemy, number one. Number two, nobody's keeping score. Number three, the structure and composition of legal teams has not changed for a very long time. And then four, there is kind of inherent ambiguity in the types of functions we perform. So really quickly going through those. Number one, efficiency is the enemy. I think many of the folks on this panel were at law firms at one point in your career. We bill by the billable hour. If I'm seeing Peter shake his head. If Peter figures out a way to do perform a task in half the amount of time it takes, he's not going to be praised and recognized. He might get fired. You're actually going to reduce the billable hour. That affects the bottom line of the firm. So we've almost been taught the opposite, which is it's okay if you take a little bit longer on that project because you're going to make more money for the firm. So it's almost built into us you know, having written down and tracked our time by 10-minute increments, you don't want efficiency. And so I saw this when I went from private practice to in-house, and I happen to be a really anal person. When I'm at restaurants and the queue isn't properly managed, I talk to the manager. Like, that's just, it's built in me. So I'm all about efficiency, but I can tell you, most of the lawyers who I've hired or I've worked with who go in-house, their efficiency is not number one on their mind. They're not really thinking about scalability and efficiency. So that's number one, because AI and analytics helps quite a bit in that regard, saving time, money, hours, etc. Number two, nobody's keeping score. There's a book that I like called Signal in the Noise, Nate Silver's book, and there's a chapter about political pundits and how every weekend millions of Americans tune in to the political channels to hear about predictions. You know, what are these political pundits going to say about who's going to win the election, who's going to win that election? Nate Silver actually tracked how accurate they were. And what he found was that at the end of the day, our grandmothers would probably do a better job at predicting who's going to win an election. But yet people continue to tune in and listen to these pundits and hang on the edge of their seats, waiting to hear them, because nobody's keeping score. The same thing is true in the world of legal. So think about on your teams that you're on, how often do you keep track of, you know, those decisions you made or your colleagues made or other teams made? How do they turn out? How accurate, how frequently are they making the best decisions that lead to the best results? We don't track it. And to be honest with you, most of the lawyers that I talk to, they don't want to track it. It's actually not good. What's inevitable is that the data is proliferating. And so whether or not they want to track it, the data is being tracked. And so for litigation, for instance, you can go to Lex Machina, or you can go to, you know, Docket Navigator. You can find all of this rich data on how our team's doing, what is their success rate. So even if they don't want to track it, the data is available and accessible. And I think that will change over time to be more data driven. But that's number two. Nobody's keeping score. Nobody wants to keep score, which is another reason, another hurdle for analytics and AI to be implemented in our worlds. Third one is the structure and composition of legal has not changed. It's mainly attorneys and some paralegals. And that has been true for a long, long time. I can tell you, when I got the chance and got the authorization to build a data science team when I was at Google, it was really, really hard. Number one, it was hard to open up the first rec and hire a data scientist who was completely outside of legal. But that is the skill set I wanted. I wanted a data scientist to come in. And even if you are able to do it, which I highly recommend because it's so impactful. And Tim, you talked about the value and importance of this kind of multidiscipline approach. I mean, talk about hiring someone completely outside of legal who brings in a completely set of skills and expertise. That's what I was able to do. But it doesn't stop there. I brought him in, and then nobody wanted to listen to him. All the lawyers would say, I don't like this young hotshot telling me what to do. And the truth is, the young hotshot wasn't telling them what to do. He was just saying, here is some data. Here are some observations I have. Why are we doing it this way? That's all he was doing. And they were really good questions, and they were really good recommendations. It was painful to get senior lawyers in the organization to just take a breath, swallow a little bit of ego, take some humility, and just listen to what the data scientist had to say. So number two, it's not enough just to hire them. You've got to empower them and put them in roles where they actually have some authority and power to make decisions and share that data. And then the last one real quick is just ambiguity. Inherently in the decisions we make and the types of functions we perform, it's hard to have clear objective evaluation criteria. Think about trial lawyers. You know, many of us deal with litigation. Ask any trial lawyer, what's the key to success in winning a trial? And they'll say, it's the story. It's the narrative, it's the themes, it's the story. It's almost like a dramatic performance. So it's really hard to train a model on how to optimize that. So it's tough, and it takes a lot of work to actually define your success criteria to be able to then start bringing in tools and AI systems and models to train them for certain types of decisions where they can be trained. If lawyers all disagree on what the success criteria is, I mean, don't start building tools and models. And the best example I have here is I've been on panels about AI and analytics where my panel members have said, yeah, you know, AI is just so far behind. It can't even come up, you know, they can't even come up with a tool that can identify the most valuable patents. And what I always say is, let's go around this panel and let's all give our definition of the most valuable patent. Every time it's going to be a different definition. Don't start training a model when you can't even get two attorneys to agree on the definition. This happens all the time. So this is the other danger when you bring in data scientists and when you bring in AI experts into legal teams. They all say, I want this and I want that. And they don't think, do we even have a gold standard? Is there even a data set that is ready to train a model so that we can deliver a better outcome? They don't go through the rigor of actually defining the hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, and then defining what is the better result. So there's a lot there. Don't want to take up too much time, but there are a number of reasons why it's been slow going in the world of legal.
I love the passion with which you approach it, though, Jeremiah. And I think what I wanted to pick up there is a really interesting point about this metrics of performance and the success criteria, which I think flows into, you know, some of these points around accountability for investment and also budget pressure. If you can't demonstrate how you're performing, budget pressure will come. So I'd like to take those kind of themes and pass them on to Sandra first, and then on to Ben. And then once we've heard from both of those, I'd like to come to you, Peter, to give us the non-IP professional to see whether you're heartened or disheartened by what you're hearing. So first, Sandra, maybe if I could turn to you.
Right. I mean, I agree with everything the panelists have said. I mean, I think every company and legal department is under a budget pressure, a need for speed, and an increasingly and potentially overwhelming amount of data. Also, you know, we are accountable for the investment. Otherwise, the investment will go away because our clients are subject to all of these pressures as well. One of the things that we do at 3M, and quite frankly, we've been lucky to do for a long time, is we run our IP department like a business. And we're very lucky because we're enabled to do that, because most years we bring in more money than the cost of running our legal department. And that can really frame a conversation with the business for us in a very different way than if you are not a cost generating center. But when you are a cost generation center, then you show value almost immediately, and it helps you buttress discussions around budget that are very specific, where you know, based on the data that you have, the areas you need to keep and spend, and it allows you to better see the areas where you can take some risk and spend less. What that does is that allows you to act strategically, but with greater speed with your clients, and maintain the necessary budget to help you run at the level that you've sort of agreed with your client or the company that you're going to run at. So a few comments from, you know, I don't know that many departments are like ours, where we bring in more than we spend. And that's not a realistic goal for many departments. But it does, when you start talking using business terms, help you, I think, on some of these metrics. But to Jeremiah and Maikke's point, you need to be really clear on what those metrics are. And that's often alignment with your business.
Fantastic. I think, yeah, the alignment with the business is something, again, that we see. I think IP professionals they're technical specialists. We are technical specialists, and we love the technical detail, but that's not something that the business community understands, and that's a barrier to that communication. Ben, let me turn to you. You've, again, cross-cultural, you've operated that accountability for investment, those success criteria. How do you think IP teams are performing in that regard, and what do you think the challenges are ahead of us?
I think one word I would use is the communication. Communicate really, really well with your stakeholders, whether it's marketing people, sales people, or your scientific research engineers or scientists. What I have found is if we keep our eye on the ball, and we're talking about money here, budget pressure, understanding of how new technologies would impact us. I think if we are able to actually understand how our clients can appreciate certain concepts, I think that's a better way, instead of to impose what we think would be, you know, these fancy, nice terms for them. I'll give you a couple of examples. In terms of money, yes, we tend to think legal is loss leader. You spend money, you don't make money. I mean, unless we are lucky as 3M, like Sandra was saying, but most legal department would be IP would be part of it, would be a cost center. But I think for intellectual property, it's really very special. I worked in the field for many years, like many of you are. I think many of our clients, technology executives, they have an innate understanding of thinking IP would be important. It's not something that they start from a perspective that this is going to be costing me money. No, most, even for startups, they start the company, they found their company based on a sort of understanding that intellectual property is something that's going to be useful. So it is our job in terms of helping them to how to spend the money, not to reduce the amount of money spending. Some quick example. For example, for tax, how is tax related to intellectual property? This is something that's so far away from IP and tax. But when I was working in China, there are direct tax policies of the local governments that if the products you're selling in the market has intellectual property protection, has patent protection, you get 10%. Otherwise, you get 25% of tax rate. That is a very simple primary school way of convincing the business people that's talking to me. Oh, one is 10%, one is 25. Get out of my office. Go do it. Do whatever patent you need to file. I will support it. And the other thing, I think, because he understood that perspective, and also for marketing, for example, there are people that actually, usually marketing, legal, they're not really the same team, but people would come to me and say, oh, I saw really great products that are being marketed by our competitor. I want to do the same thing. Can you help me to formalize the process? Well, my first formalization would be, you cannot do the same thing. But that really gets his interest in understanding intellectual property. And the same thing, so I would go train with my team of the marketing professionals so they can understand, oh, with some basic understanding of IP, they don't have to copy our the product that our competitors are making, but rather they can make their own, having worked with IP team and the scientific team. And again, they would be willing to spend money on supporting us to do that. And the same thing with R&D. I sort of thought of a concept called a directed R&D. So this is easily done in a smaller setting, but I think in a larger setting, it's done as well. For example, instead of having inventors create inventions in the vacuum and then come to the IP team and say, hey, I've created this wonderful thing, go do it for me. I've had scientists coming up with their wonderful technology combining A, B, and C, knowing that A and B is patented. And they say, oh, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to add C to it. And after 6 or 9 months, they go to the IP team and goes, please file a patent for me. We're going to sell this product. It's a wonderful product because it's not the same as A and B. Well, you can imagine that's not going to be a really happy news for us. So we want to get in there early with them in their project meeting, in the discussion of the potential projects. We do sort of forecast of due diligence, if you will. And we opine on the type of things that may be patentable, and they can also create a good research project. So these early communication, engaging your clients, again, in the same way of AI, I think from a very low level of understanding of AI, instead of using the fancy terms of AI, just understanding, tell the IP department data. We do IDSs, we do searches. If we use good technology to come up with good prior art or discover better patents. And again, I have examples, literally real life examples of how we got hurt by not having good enough technology to do these type of data searches. I think the IP team members would probably be a lot more receptive once the AI, the so-called AI approaches would be translated into terms that impact their daily work, impact the results of what they produce, so that it's much more of a ready acceptance for these IP team members, lawyers, on the other side, on the business people as well. So again, going back, communication. Communicate well with what you want to do, with what your clients wanted to hear or wanted to accomplish. And that way you have a lot easier time in discussing budgets or strategies going forward.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Ben. And so talking to communication, let's communicate with somebody who's not in the IP team. Peter.
Well, I just wanted, I was practically leaping out of my chair, Ben, when you were just making your comments, because, first of all, I would say that part of the innovation sphere, we think about like kind of technology innovation. There's also innovation in how we think about ourselves relative to the rest of our business and the rest of our, environment. Here's one area I want to tell you about, a very exciting development, and that is, I think part of your challenge as IP, managers and sort of IP leaders is that you're innovators themselves are bereft of information and about how they can more thoughtfully, more strategically frame their investigations in a way that leads them in a path where value creation is going to be the outcome. I don't think we train our scientists and engineers very well, Ben. In fact, you know, I went all the way through a PhD at Stanford and ended up only encountering my first IP class doing my MBA at Berkeley. And in fact, Susan Harrison was this one of the teachers, and that class of intellectual capital management was a profound experience for me as a scientist. We at UC Berkeley, you may have heard that Bo Hayden and Lee Fleming are leading a very innovative program where we're taking master's degree students in engineering, not in the law school, and we're taking them through the practical issues associated with IP development and IP management. And we're giving teams of students real IP dockets to do market analysis and customer discovery with. And we are finding that these students are finding enormous illumination in how to do customer discovery and value identification at the outset of doing a project, instead of, as you said, going along for 8 months, coming up with a great widget and saying, go patent this for me because I think it's interesting. This customer-driven approach to innovation is something that I think we need, the IP community can teach back into the innovation community. And so I just welcome you all to encourage the IP, your VPs of research. I would encourage you, don't just do lunchtime lectures on, here's what a patent is and here's what, dockets and various things are. Talk about how you understand and uncover value creation through innovation in what the customer needs. The final thing I'd say is there is a very exciting program that the US National Science Foundation is doing called the Innovation Corps. The US Department of Energy has also copied this, Department of Defense has now copied this, taking research scientists who have an invention, Ben, that they've already thought is interesting, and put them through 8 weeks of grueling customer discovery. In 8 weeks, these nerds are told to do 100 or more customer discovery interviews. And many times, not only do they discover that the initial invention doesn't really apply to what they thought it was, but it pivots to a much greater value proposition. But it also has changed their perspective on themselves as innovators. There's one thing I'd love to see is a greater integration of the research and the engineering community with the IP community. I think undergraduate curriculum should have a mandatory IP strategy class. If you're going to graduate with a science degree, the work that you all do is ultimately going to be one of the most important manifestations.
Just add one thing to what Peter said, Tim.
I'm very conscious of time, Ben, and because we just have 5 minutes left, and we're all going to have to skip some topics. So if I might, I would perhaps ask you to hold it, and then we'll come back, because what I'm going to do is actually the whole question of the IP service provider market. I think, Chris, again, we've realized we're over ambitious. We start asking questions, and there's so many thoughts and so many perspectives that we're really just not getting. It's just too interesting a topic. Hopefully that's what it means. Anyway, so let's we're going to move over the IP service provider market. It can be seen as a bit technical, and there's lots of questions I think about how the service provider market is servicing in-house IP teams. We'll have to save that for another day, because what I really want to take is Peter's comment about how we teach and how we're teaching engineers, and how to teach them to come together with IP lawyers earlier in the process, to take that segue into the final question that we really want to be asking here. So if we want today's discussion to have ongoing value for the CIP community, some of these thoughts about how we are performing well, how we're not performing well, how we're behind the curve, how we might be ahead of the curve, how can we turn them into something that's actionable? So what kind of data do we need, as Jeremiah is saying? If we're not measuring it, we can't manage it. Are we giving ourselves a score? So I guess that's all wrapped up in what do we need to be teaching the students of today to put them in the right place to be leading an IP function of a business. We've only looked kind of future cast maybe 10 years. The students of today are going to be there in 20 years' time, maybe they'll be in 10 years. They'll be so advanced and so well trained.
They better go fast. I'd say they better go faster. Yeah.
So what do we need to be teaching them? Let me come to Maikke on that, if I may.
I think we need to make sure that they learn about a lot of more things in IP, and that they learn to talk to people, to ask for more information so that their perspective is broader. And with that, I can't say they should learn kind of finance or they should learn how you run a business, but I think there should be in all these people a kind of trigger to think about something else, to take a different perspective and to look at things from outside rather than the inside, and from a novel perspective rather than the traditional mainstream. And if we have IP people who can do that, I'm sure that they will spot the opportunity to use data or to look into a diverse perspective on tax issues or on privacy law and security. So I would say let's make them curious for other knowledge.
Brilliant and beautifully put. I think it's as I've said, many of us are deep technical specialists, and it's almost like that the depth of that technical specialism is one of our burdens, because we get that becomes our perspective, and what we need to do is to develop into those T-shaped people much more quickly, and be able to bring those perspectives back more quickly. Sandra, perhaps over to you. What should we be teaching people?
I agree with Maikke. So I'd say three things. One, being really effective communicators so that they can align and collaborate. Two, having a general understanding of business, basic terms, basic finance terms. As Maikke said, they don't have to run a business, but they have to be able to communicate and collaborate with those who do. And they have to understand business strategies sufficiently well to align them with legal, and in this forum, specifically IP strategies. And you need to know some amount of business knowledge to do that effectively. And three, a lot of lawyers, what law school teaches you is to spot issues, issue spotting. And I think almost all clients now who are under budget pressure, speed, et cetera, they don't want a litany of issues that you're spotting. They want partnership to identify and comfortably dismiss the issues that are low risk, low value, and to focus on those that matter. That allows you to partner effectively and communicate effectively.
Excellent. Again, really good points. I like the point about we're taught to spot issues, because it's you get marked for getting the comma that's in the wrong place when you're at law school, don't you? Not for this complete strategy is wrong. Ben, next. Couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think.
What would you say? What should we be teaching people?
I think I've taught a couple of law schools, and I realized that the students really wanted to learn not only IP law, but really technology, marketing, business. When they're so young, like Maikke was saying, a comprehensive education is really, really important. Like Peter was saying, and I mentioned that as well, a lot of the IP decisions, how effective you are, is not just purely legal questions. Maybe I'm biased because I've been in-house counsel for many years, like many of us are. But I think eventually keep our eye on the ball. It's not just how many issues you can spot, but rather how these issues are impacting the business or impacting the technology. How is it going to help you to create better inventions that are IP protectable? I think that's a good opportunity for the students to learn in school. I mean, I've tutored, I've lectured in when I was at the companies, but the younger you embed these interests, these concepts, approaches into their minds, the better it is to them to be more effective as a future IP team members. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. Jeremiah.
Yeah, I could not agree more with my my panel.
What should be, you're probably teaching some of them already at Facebook.
Well, I was going to say, I think my panel's already kind of nailed it, especially Maikke and Sandra's comments. I would just, I'd end with the illustration of the old fox versus hedgehog. When there's danger, the hedgehog curls up, and the fox, figures out clever ways to get out of the danger. I think for a long time, IP professionals have been taught to be hedgehogs. We've been taught to focus and keep blinders on to really kind of focus on what we do and the craft that we do. But it's been at the expense of all the things that my panel has talked about today, Peter and Ben, Sandra and Maikke. And this is actually why when you look across IP departments, this is why things have not changed for so long. Basic patent strategy, this idea of patent coverage, we need to cover all the features that our business is putting out. None of these make sense. So my first bit of advice that I think aligns well with what you mentioned, Tim, around CIP's kind of fundamental principle of being T-shaped, and Bo talks about this all the time, be a fox, question the status quo. And if you see something that hasn't changed for 20, 30 years, question away and start to ask those hard questions like, why do we do it this way? It doesn't seem to make sense to me. Right. And continue to push the boundaries and change the industry, because I think, you are the future. And as more and more people like you come in with that T-shaped approach, soon our industry will be filled with foxes rather than hedgehogs.
Thank you, Jeremiah. My connection seems a little bit slow, but hopefully you're getting me live now. Peter, are you encouraged by what you hear, or in terms of what we should be teaching, or what would you like to add to that?
Well, I think you can tell magically, Tim, you managed to sort of convene a panel with great kindred spirits, and many of us, I think, although we're coming from different pathways, are really identifying very similar things. So that is encouraging. At the same time, just as you all find that the legal community can be, recalcitrant and slow to change, you look back into the law school world and go, oh, I don't know how we'll ever change that. I have the similar challenge with science and engineering programs. I would say the one driver, though, and Jeremiah, you mentioned this, is that the early career people are the ones who want to see this change the most. The ones who are graduating now from business schools, the ones who are graduating now from law schools, the ones who are graduating now from the master's programs and the PhD programs in science, they know that the world can be different. They want to drive this change. And so, Sandra, when you said 10 or 20, I forget which one, who said 10 or 20 years, I'm sitting there thinking, God, I hope it's faster. And I think it can be faster, but I think this is where I would ask you all, the number one thing you can do, everybody on this call, scientists and engineers would just love to hear from you at your local university, in a local chat group or whatever. The simple, Ben said, the fundamental thing is communication. There can never be enough of it. And I just appreciate the work that you all are doing here.
Well, that's you've summarized it very well there, Peter. Particularly, I've really enjoyed your outsider perspective on all of this, and it feels like we kind of have a manifesto for change here as something that we need to capture. I'm very conscious of the time. We've run over the allotted time slot. I think there's been some questions. Chris, I don't know whether there's questions there. Carla, I don't know whether people are whether you're happy to go on. Panelists, I don't know whether you're happy to run a little longer.
There's no questions in the chat,
right?
But Anna, I think, would like to ask a question if everyone can just.
Hello, Anna.
That'll probably be the last throw.
Hi guys. In no means I want to keep you from some of you celebrating your Friday evening. But if people do want to stick around for some questions, I would love to. So nice seeing all of you. We miss you in Gothenburg, that's for sure. And for those of you who haven't been with us in Gothenburg yet, you're more than welcome to come when this horrendous time is all over again. I kind of want to bring up a point on this discussion about young leaders. We meet with them every day. And I think that when discussing IP teams in 2025, I really want to bring forward some of the perspectives that they keep telling us that they want and need. Because of course, these are the people that we hope to see in your organizations. And first of all, I think that bringing back the point to the discussion of diversion or diversity, this is not something that I think our students will leave organizations if they can't find. I don't think they will even enter organizations where they can't find diversity. And I think that this is a really important point to make. And the reason that we started the Equality and Diversity Project, the VERE project of CIP, in 2016 was because we left CIP Forum in 2016 with the realization that our students were asking, where is the diversity? And how are we going to fit into this? And that was originally why we started the Vera project, because we sensed an urgency from our students to be able to recreate what the IP market looked like in order for them to feel like they could get access to that. So I think that that's a hygiene factor going forward for young leaders, whether you can present a diverse organization that they feel like they are included in and can fit into. But in relation to that, I also want to go back to a point that's been made during the panel and that Keith Brigelt also made. What motivates the next generation of young leaders? And diversity being one of the things, I also think that sustainability and finding purpose in your work life is one of those. And I kind of want to get the panel's thoughts on how could you better create a connection between the work that you do in the IP function to the larger purpose of your company and your organization, and how can you move away from this what we sometimes experience as a very sort of proprietary profits only logic within the IP sphere that has, I swear to God, no attraction with the majority of our students, and help them see that the IP function actually is there to help the purpose of the company, and the purpose hopefully being, and for many of your organizations being, to create a better society. Because that's the reason that many of our students sometimes shy away from the IP profession and instead move on into roles as CTOs or chief marketing officers or CEOs, because they feel like they can get more influence over questions like that. So how can we better connect the understanding of the IP function with the purpose of the company and the organization and the sustainability that many of your organizations are trying to create? Huge question, I realize, but if you have any thoughts, we're happy to have them.
So this is Sandra. Oh,
go ahead. I was going to just open up the floor and invite, as we're really in the free for all now. So please, Sandra, go ahead.
Great. I have to run to another meeting, so I'll jump in first if no one else minds. I think it's a great question, and I completely agree with the two key premises, the importance of both diversity and sustainability from those entering the job market right now. The people we so desperately are competing for top talent. It's a hard question. I agree with that too. But I think some of the answers that I have are that, one, if you have a company or organization that is very committed to sustainability, it has a lot of R&D programs around sustainability. That's something nice that we have at 3M. So pretty much every patent attorney or agent that we work with gets to work on sustainability projects. And that's really energizing and motivating and exciting for people. And even a broader than sustainability, yesterday we announced at 3M that we created tags that stick on polar bears so they can track the polar bears up in Saskatchewan, which is not directly sustainability, but that is a feel-good story that people like working on that type of work. The second thing I'd say is organizations that really support pro bono efforts. I love getting to work with a variety of really startups who are in the pro bono category and help them secure their rights to advance their ideas, quite frankly, without which the IP protection, I think I would really worry about their ability to compete as a startup going forward. We love to pair all of our attorneys with those types of opportunities because they allow you to see something very differently than you do at a large corporation like 3M. So it not only benefits society and real people, it also helps our attorneys and agents develop their skill set and see something from a different perspective and get that connection to the value that IP brings to society more generally. So hopefully those two answers are at least a little bit of a helpful answer on the great question. Thank you so much. This has been a great panel. I too have to leave.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Sandra, and particularly those last two. I mean, I could, yeah, please, Ben.
So I think, Anna, the one way that I would approach in teaching my students would be to view intellectual property as a tool and as a part of a larger scheme of innovation. It is not something that's independently pursued, absent of any good inventions. This is why I always ask my clients, you can file 1,000 patents, I'll file 1,000 patents for you, but where is the invention? The invention drives really good patents, intellectual property. And for that matter, that can produce a lot broader impact on the world than just any assets evaluation, deregulation, commoditization. For example, some of the inventions that are being produced can have a great impact. I remember I saw a story about one of the younger gentlemen that invented a great way of harvesting ocean garbage using one of those big things. I don't exactly remember the details, and also I was involved with clients that were actually producing a good filter for water filtration that can be used in villages in India without any battery, any sort of electricity. So these are the things that are technology-wise that can really make impact on people's lives. And then how do they actually create these inventions? I think IP is a huge part of it. Going back to what Peter was saying, if you're aware of intellectual property concepts and how as a tool, just like math, 1 + 2 = 3, or chemistry, whatever, biology, then you're able to help organizations to utilize their financial resources to produce those inventions that are patentable and can be applied to a wider world to be more efficient, less costly, waste less energy. I think these are the things that students can actually keep in their minds when they're learning intellectual property. They don't have to be a patent lawyer in the future. Again, if they become a scientist, I think it helps to know some basic concept of IP knowledge, IP values, so that they can actually apply that knowledge in their future work, whether they're scientists or working for a non-for-profit or whatever it is in a for-profit organization.
Ben, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious that we have a slightly reducing audience. I think perhaps I can, and I'm sure I'm also aware that Peter needs to run very soon. I guess, thank you, Peter. Thanks once again. Really, really value that external perspective.
Great to meet you all. Let's keep the conversation up. Thank you very much for having me today.
And so, given that I see, I guess this is now the final. This is kind of the open-ended question that I'm not anticipating to answer now. But Carla and Anna and Maikke as a key player within CIP, and Chris as well. There seems to be some really strong messages coming here. I really like what we've had from Peter as an external coming in to stir that pot and shake it up as well. So I think this is what we need to take away. This feels like a manifesto for trying to, produce the curriculum for the IP head of IP of 2030. I think what we need to do is continue this conversation offline to see what that looks like and how we can try and move it forward in the context of CIP. And as I said earlier, bringing in the other diverse perspective from the Eastern Hemisphere as well. Thank you all for your contributions. Thank you, Maikke and Ben, in particular for your contributions. Thank you, Chris, for all of your support. Thank you, Carla, for helping us put it all together. Thank you, Anna, for stirring it up at the end. It's Friday.
Tim, for sharing the tips and for preparing so well.
Well, thank you. I say Chris was super helpful in this, and he really is a partner in crime. I just happen to have been the talking head most of the time. So yes, it's late on Friday evening. For me, it's even later for my European colleagues. So we'll say thank you all for your contributions. Very happy to connect with people on LinkedIn or otherwise to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.
For the organization.
To all the speakers and to all the professionals and to all the students who have been following the entire week. It's been great, despite not being a real CIP forum in the physical way. But it's been fantastic, really inspirational, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversations.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.